All right, so these are just some very preliminary thoughts. I haven't really gone in depth at all, but there are a couple of terms that you want to think about your definitions from the beginning, and you may need to define them different ways on both sides of the topic. And then I think there are a couple of issues that come up about the allotment of burdens. And then there are a few approaches I think you can take on the affirmative, and one kind of interesting approach you could take on the negative, and that ought to be enough to get you started with your thinking. I think that you're going to want to be ready to defend a fairly tight definition of need. Because the first couple of definitions that you'll find in the dictionary will be all about something that you have to have or you suffer a consequence. But if you get further down, one of the last ones will typically be that it's tied up with poverty or destitution. That there was a family that found itself in need. And it's not just, it's hot, we need an air conditioner. It's, we're bankrupt, we don't know how to feed ourselves. And if you do that, then I think that on the negative, and in some cases even on the affirmative, you can say that the debate really needs to be constrained. The parameter of the debate needs to be nations giving assistance, foreign assistance that is in nature kind of development assistance, that is about anti-poverty efforts, anti-hunger efforts, anti-illiteracy efforts, anti-disease efforts, and quite possibly disaster response, but limited to something like that. Otherwise, you get into a lot of different ways that nations can be helpful to one another, and the topic loses its coherent core, and what both sides have to do just to be ready to debate all the possible applications gets kind of outrageous. Now, I don't know how well that argument flies, but at least if you are good at articulating why that interpretation of need, that need is tied to poverty or destitution, if you are familiar and fluent with that argument, I think that's going to come in handy a lot of the time. A second thing that you should be ready to define is the word nation. Now, nation, if you look, one of the first couple of definitions will be that it's an area of geography with a political unit, with a government. But if you look down the list, one of the other definitions will be that it is a people group. It's a people with a traditional homeland, some culture in common, a history of a shared language. And there are a lot of different applications having to do with attempted genocide, where a people group or a nation is targeted, and countries could get involved to assist nations when they are in need, when they are at general risk of being wiped off the face of the earth and out of the history books. So I think that that is, you want to do a little game testing, a little play testing with different definitions of those two terms in particular, because they could change the subject matter in some ways that are strategically relevant. Then there are, I think, two issues where there's going to be a little bit of a wrestling match over how much the affirmative has to do to satisfy their burden, and one of those is moral obligation. And it's probably already occurred to you that a savvy negative is going to say that moral obligation is a very, very tight burden. It's a very high hurdle to get over. It can't just be that it's a good idea, it's on balance beneficial. It's got to be a lot better than that. Your first instinct might be to say that it has to fit within a framework, that there has to be some sort of value premise behind it for it to be a moral obligation. But I think an intriguing way to go might be to say that your duty, if it's a moral obligation, is so compelling that you then have a duty to weather, if necessary, extreme consequences in order to fulfill that duty. And I know a lot of people who do NCFCA, Lincoln Douglas, really hate Nazi illustrations. I'm going to throw this one out. You might find a different one that's better from a different part of history. But just to get you started, I think you could say that the people during World War II who hid Jewish people so that the Nazis couldn't round them up, the ones who did the hiding, the ones who were their helpers, that they put themselves in danger of dying themselves when, by simply deciding differently, they could have been perfectly safe, as far as they knew, until the war turned against them. But they did that because they felt that there was a moral obligation. Not because it would make them feel nice, not because there was some advantage to be had, but because they felt the compulsion, they felt the obligation, and it was the highest order obligation. It was so high order that even the fact that their own lives were in danger was not sufficient reason to make them change what they had decided to do. So I think that's one thing that negatives ought to say is a burden of affirmatives, that the affirmative has to continue to defend countries' involvement in other countries' affairs even when the consequences are severe. And the other thing is, I think there's a burden that comes along with the word assistance. The question is going to be, are you talking about just an offer of assistance, something that could plausibly be recognized as assistance, or are you talking about something that genuinely makes a difference? And here's my crackpot analogy for this particular question. Let's say that I see someone who is drowning in front of me in the water. Now, an attempted assistance, I could stand there on the shore and I could, off a piece of paper, read them swimming instructions. Try paddling, turn your head, and you can get your head out of the water and breathe. That's assistance, I guess, some way. You could recognize that they're drowning, I'm talking about swimming. That's an attempt, that's an offer of assistance, but it's one that really isn't going to make any difference. A real offer of assistance would be if I jumped in the water and put myself at risk. So I think that on the negative, what you ought to do is you ought to say that, first of all, the affirmative has to prove that the involvement that they talk about in any particular illustrations, they have what actually resolved the matter. And secondly, they have to prove that it's so important that even if there were severe consequences, we would still be justified in going ahead with it. And the example that occurred to me was if they wanted to talk about North Korea, then you could say it would not be enough for them to talk about sanctioning North Korea to try to keep the nuclear weapons program under control. It would not be enough to do that to try to weaken the regime and bring it down because the North Korean people are in such need. And some of the stories about the starvation they undergo at the wrong time of year, those are hair-raising. But what the affirmative would have to do is the affirmative would have the burden of saying that the United States or another nation with an advanced military, possibly China, has a duty to go in with troops to topple the regime, to effectively do what we did in Iraq. Even though North Korea, in defending itself, would probably launch its nuclear arsenal in every direction. That the affirmative has the burden of persuading the judge that that would be warranted because there is a duty. And if the affirmative can't prove that it is rational and appropriate and persuade the judge to approve of that course of action, then the affirmative hasn't met their burden. All right, a couple of ways that I think you could go on the affirmative if you took the definition of need and you defined it a little more loosely and you said that it was something that is urgent but not necessarily tied to poverty. One of the interesting things is I think you could talk about extradition treaties and you could talk about international law enforcement assistance, and where nations have fugitives that escape to other parts of the world, do the other nations have a duty to help track them down and return them? And you could get off into that literature, and I think you'll find that a lot of what's written is written approvingly. It says that it needs to be done the right way, but really that there needs to be no safe haven for criminals. It needs to be important that they not just be able to cross a border and then live with impunity. So that's one direction I think you could go. I think you could talk also about military intervention. I think you could talk about how the United States had a moral obligation to roll back Iraq's invasion of Kuwait back in 1990, the thing that set Saddam Hussein's downfall in motion all the way back at the beginning of the first Gulf War. And I think you could say that where nations have left aggression unaddressed, well, you don't want to do that because that's not really a moral argument anymore. It's a consequentialist argument. But I think if you went into the literature about aggressive war, and in particular went into Nuremberg and the Nuremberg precedent about how aggressive war is something that can be prosecuted, and all nations have a consensus that aggressive war has to be rolled back because it is a breach of duty, then I think you've got into something where you could make a pretty interesting argument about moral obligation, and it wouldn't necessarily be right up the middle of what your opponents were expecting to debate. It could be that they come with all of their arguments calibrated for foreign assistance, anti-poverty type debates, and the military one might wrongfoot them just a little bit. Kind of similar to what I was saying about extradition, but maybe a little bit different. And actually this is kind of tied to military intervention as well. Do nations have an obligation to become involved to put a stop to genocide? And where I would begin is, if I were you, I would go back and read up on Rwanda in 1994, which a lot of nations outside the region, issued weak notes of protest and diplomatic telegrams of concern, but really didn't do anything that was likely to make a difference. So if you were to get into that and say I think it was the Tutsis. It was either the Tutsis or the Hutus who were targeted in the genocide efforts. And if you were to say that we really did have a duty to get involved to assist them, not because they were impoverished, but because they were in danger of being wiped out, then that I think is probably a pretty compelling way into that debate. And that puts a lot of pressure on the negative. Now the negative, I think your toehold in that is to say, but we're talking about assistance, not resistance, but assistance. We're talking about how we would need to be entangled with someone on the ground. And it just popped into my head while I'm saying this. You could say that assistance means we need to be directly involved, and whoever we're partnering with needs to be taking the major share of the action. We need to really just be backing them up, providing them with what they don't have in order to overcome whatever the threat is to them. And that, I think, if you talk about how Rwanda doesn't really fit that profile, how they were really kind of a targeted group and they couldn't participate in their own rescue, then you could say that's not really a case of assistance, and so affirmatives really can't do that. But that, again, that's a kind of definition issue that I think you could bat back and forth probably pretty productively. So if I were you, I would take a look at the Rwanda issue, because I think that it could be one that's really very vivid and really very compelling for judges. A couple of other possibilities. I was thinking that you could talk about helping Israel catch Nazi fugitives, kind of like the trial of Eichmann and the extradition of John Demjanjuk from the United States. And that could be just an illustration in the extradition debate, or it could be tied up with the genocide debate, or it could be just its own freestanding argument. But anyway, it's kind of an interesting way into the debate. And then finally, I had jotted down that you could get into the literature about the globalization of trade and about how nations need to be good trading partners. And there is some of it that talks about how there's a particular duty to do that whenever your trading partners are in recession, which would make them in need. That those are times when you should modify your negotiating stance, because all of us are interdependent. And we act in a way that is damaging to everyone's interests, including our own, when we don't take into account the global interdependence we now have. Now, what that leaves for negative ground, that's an interesting question. But that's something that possibly you'll winnow out if you decide to go that direction. And you'll figure out that here's the proffer I can make. I can say that the negative has the ground to take this position, and then it won't seem quite so unreasonable or quite so circular. All right, one interesting negative approach I think you could take is I think you could say that if the affirmative is going to take the position that assisting those who are in need is a moral obligation, then that means that no nation can ever use sanctions, because sanctions create a need. They are an attempt to exert leverage by creating needs, by impoverishing nations. And it's going to be kind of a challenge, because the history of the use of sanctions is not very promising. But you might find a few cases where they've been reasonably effective. You might look to South Africa in the 1980s. We kept sanctions, the whole world basically sanctioned South Africa for a very long time, and finally the regime did crumble. And then the sanctions on Iraq throughout the mid to late 1990s and early 2000s, which at least kept them from building their military up anymore and did put pressure on them, even if ultimately it took the invasion in 2003 to topple the regime. What you could do is you could say, if there are any circumstances in which sanctions are the best option that produces the most humane outcome, that spares the most people, that best carries out our duty, then the affirmative has to lose the debate, because the stance that the topic requires them to take says that we are morally forbidden to use sanctions. So you might explore that and see where that takes you. Anyway, those are my opening thoughts, and I'm sure more is going to occur to me as the summer goes on, but if any of those are things that you hadn't thought of already, take them and good luck with them.